I had one of those moments last week that just kind of crystallizes a much bigger, much darker trend.
Oh, yeah.
I was observing a high-stakes recruitment seminar for a major engineering firm. You know, the kind of place whose work determines if a bridge stands up or a power grid stays online.
Right. Critical infrastructure.
Exactly. And there was this one candidate everyone was buzzing about, a supposed star from a top university. The resume was just, I mean, heavy with awards for social impact and transformative leadership.
The modern elite candidate, all about the ideological credentials.
Precisely. And this person, they spoke for 20 minutes with this polished, articulate fluency about inclusive design and dismantling systemic barriers. The room, especially the HR folks, they seemed completely captivated by just the sheer moral weight of the presentation.
I sense a butt coming.
A big one. The lead structural engineer, I mean, this guy looked like he'd spent 30 years climbing scaffolds and reading blueprints in the rain. He asks a single, very specific, very rudimentary technical question about load-bearing stress points.
A simple back-of-the-envelope calculation.
The kind of thing any junior engineer has to be able to do in their sleep. And the silence was absolute, deafening. But what came next was even more telling.
He didn't have the answer.
Didn't even try. Didn't reach for a pen. Instead, they just smoothly pivoted and suggested that focusing on rigid technicalities was, and I'm quoting here, a form of gatekeeping that marginalized the human narrative of the project.
Wow. So their lack of technical competence was reframed as a moral stance against an oppressive system.
And here's the truly unsettling part. The younger HR directors in the room, they were nodding in agreement. They seemed far more impressed by the candidate's ability to morally reframe their own technical ignorance than they were concerned about, the bridge actually standing up.
That's chilling.
That moment, it wasn't just a bad interview. It felt like a flashpoint, a clear symptom of a deep systemic rot. So our mission today is to really dig into this. The sources we're looking at argue that as we hit the middle of this decade, we're approaching what statisticians call the Great Cliff.
A point where we've systematically replaced objective excellence with this. This sort of therapeutic ideology that rewards identity and compliance over actual demonstrable ability.
So the question is, how did a civilization that once prized merit and technical rigor get here? And what happens when our most complex, life-sustaining systems are run by people who prioritize feeling right over being right?
That tension, that structural fracture between ideological purity and technical competence, that's the engine of this deep dive. And the sources are, they are absolutely clear on this. Complex systems across the West are showing accelerating signs of failure. And it's not random. It's because of a systematic preference for the unqualified, coupled with the sidelining of the most competent.
This isn't just about campus politics, is it?
Not at all. This is about a measurable, quantifiable decline in operational effectiveness and safety. It's about whether the lights stay on.
Okay, let's unpack that shift. Because when you look at history, it's just shocking to think we would ever intentionally choose to downgrade ability. The sources seem to agree that the real high point for selection based on pure ability was between, the 1920s and the 1960s?
That's the starting line, yeah. That's the true rise of meritocracy. Before that era, it was mostly about who you were. Your family, your wealth, your class. That's what dictated your access to the best jobs, the best universities.
But then something changed.
Something profound. As the 20th century progressed, there's this incredible embrace of quantifiable systematic selection. Aptitude tests, of all things, became this revolutionary tool for identifying raw talent, regardless of someone's background.
We're talking about the big ones, the famous testing batteries, the SAT, the GRE, the Wonderlic for professional screening.
The LS for law school, and the incredibly effective Army General Classification Test, which sorted millions of recruits during World War II. These were meritocratic mechanisms. They were designed to flatten social advantages and just identify the raw cognitive horsepower you needed for increasingly complex tasks.
And the achievements of that era, it's not a coincidence.
Not at all. The sources connect it directly. The electrification of the Tennessee Valley, the Manhattan Project, the invention of the transistor, and of course the moon landing, these were all driven by this relentless, systematic selection for competence. The foundational principle was just find the most capable person for the job, period.
But that singular focus, as the research shows, ran headfirst into a powerful new political force, right after the mid-1960s. That's the collision of imperative.
That's the perfect phrase for it. The collision was between meritocracy, selecting strictly for measurable ability, and the political imperative of protected group diversity, which really crystallized after the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
And that's where the legal framework began to shift.
Almost immediately. The authorities began to accept that statistically observable disparities in outcomes, so differences in success rates between different groups, were prima facie evidence of illegal discrimination.
So wait, just to be clear, if a test showed that Group A was succeeding at a much higher rate than Group B, the outcome itself was seen as proof that the test was biased.
Exactly. Or the process. It didn't matter if the test was accurately measuring a required skill. The core assumption was, and in many ways still is, that if all groups are identical in talent, then any fair process must yield proportionate outcomes.
And if it doesn't?
Then the system must be biased. That established the enduring norm we see playing out today. When meritocracy and diversity conflict, diversity has to take priority.
And the first major domino to fall from that was cognitive testing in the workplace.
Correct. Employers, frankly, were terrified of high-profile, incredibly costly enforcement actions based on these statistical disparities. So in the early 1970s, they just stopped. They stopped using quantitative cognitive testing to screen for ability.
They outsourced the problem.
They completely outsourced the selection problem. Instead of risking a lawsuit by testing people directly, they started demanding degrees from highly selective universities. And that single shift, it effectively made the entire U.S. university system the new high-stakes gatekeeper for the professional class.
Which just moved the battlefield from the hiring desk to the admissions office. But let's ground this again. Let's bring this abstract decline back into the real world. Infrastructure safety. You mentioned the story of Arthur, the systems engineer.
Arthur's story is, I think, chilling because it shows the failure cascade in real time. He was a senior systems engineer, Midwest, responsible for these incredibly complex industrial systems, including parts of the electrical grid.
Yeah.
And he reportedly just watched as the highly rigorous math-heavy protocols that had kept these systems stable for decades were slowly replaced by what his company called equity-aligned operational frameworks.
And what did that actually mean during a crisis?
Well, there was a critical system failure, the kind that threatens a blackout. And he said he observed the junior staff who are hired under this new regime. They froze. They were technically and mathematically unprepared to troubleshoot. They couldn't perform the fundamental, complex calculations needed to diagnose the problem in real time.
So he had to step in.
He had to step in and fix the glitch himself. And he had this horrifying realization that the people who were nominally in charge just lacked the foundational grasp required for the job.
The technical rigor was gone. It was deemed gatekeeping. And the consequence wasn't a slightly delayed email. It was the world potentially grinding to a halt, a blackout.
Yeah.
That story makes this whole competence crisis horribly concrete.
And that operational failure, it's a perfect entry point to examine the institutional playbook. How do institutions actually enforce these diversity mandates, especially when, qualified candidates just aren't there?
The sources borrow a framework for this, right?
Yeah.
From police escalation tactics, the ask, tell, make model.
Exactly. Let's start with ask. That's the subtle pressure stage.
So what does ask look like in a corporate setting?
Ask is the soft enforcement. It's designed to eliminate bias by subtly shaping a manager's behavior. This includes things like slating guidelines, where you require managers to interview a certain number or type of diverse candidates for every single opening, whether they're qualified or not.
And structured interviews.
Right. Using these rigid scripts to minimize any personal rapport or commonality, trying to force the conversation onto just standardized bullet points. But the most potent ask tactic is the HR involvement,
where the hiring manager has to actively defend their choice, not to hire a diverse candidate.
And that creates immense pressure. It creates a massive career risk. If you reject a protected group candidate, even if they are clearly, demonstrably incompetent, you could face internal investigations, shaming, damage to your reputation, maybe lose a promotion. So to avoid that high professional cost, what do managers do?
They preemptively prioritize diversity, even if it goes against their better technical judgment.
And that fear-driven choice leads directly to the dilution of standards. We see this especially in really specialized sectors like finance or high-tech engineering.
There's a hedge fund example in the research.
Yeah, it's a perfect illustration. When they couldn't fill their analyst roles with enough diverse candidates who met the ideal spec, say, an experienced investment banker with a top MBA, they just had to dilute the requirements.
How so?
First, they stripped the work experience requirement. Then, when that wasn't enough, they dropped the MBA requirement, offering the role to undergraduate interns. The minimum competence bar gets lowered and lowered again just to fill the quota.
So what happens when they inevitably make a bad hire under these compromise standards?
Well, the risk of a wrongful termination lawsuit is often seen as too high, especially if that person was hired specifically to meet a diversity target. So instead of addressing the incompetence, the firm just adjusts its internal structure.
They create a make-work position.
Essentially. The diverse bad hire is giving harmless busy work or placed in some non-critical administrative role until hopefully they leave of their own accord. It's an incredibly inefficient, unsustainable way to operate, and it just erodes capacity across the entire board.
Okay, so when ask tactics aren't fast enough, the institution moves to tell.
Right. This is where the carrots and sticks come out. This is the managerial enforcement layer, using key performance indicators or KPIs.
So diversity targets become hard metrics, linked directly to a manager's bonus, their compensation, their whole career path.
Exactly. And these are used to shame leaders and teams who aren't meeting their targets. And because senior leadership, who were, hired 30 years ago under a different system, is often predominantly white men, these aggressive KPIs send a very clear, if unspoken, message down to the middle management layer.
And that message is what?
The message is that if you are a highly competent white man in middle management, you are very likely to be passed over for promotion, regardless of your performance, until the diversity quotas are met above you.
That has to be profoundly demoralizing.
It is. It creates this deep sense of betrayal. And the competent high performers, they face a really difficult choice. They can collaborate fully, embrace allyship and support the new ideological goals. They can coast, just doing the bare minimum to avoid being noticed. Or, and this is happening more and more, they leave. They leave high-status employment entirely for fields where merit still seems to reign, often outside the corporate mainstream.
And then finally, when the soft pressure and the carrots and sticks fail, we get to make.
This is the end game, holding different groups to different standards, sometimes implementing outright quotas, which often requires the total elimination of competency testing.
This is where the selection processes are fundamentally redefined. We saw this laid bare in the Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard lawsuit, didn't we?
Absolutely. The documents from that case revealed that Harvard was systematically penalizing Asian and white applicants on these subjective personality scores, specifically to aid Black and Hispanic applicants. It was a demonstration of differential standards in real time.
And even where formal affirmative action is outlawed, institutions find workarounds, proxies.
Like the UC system in California, which is a really striking example. After Prop 209 banned formal affirmative action, the UC system started using these comprehensive admission reviews to engineer their outcomes.
How did they do that?
They manipulated acceptance rates by using high school proxies. They would cut the acceptance rate at an academically rigorous, heavily Asian high school like Arcadia from, say, 37% down to 13%. At the same time, they would boost the acceptance rate at a high-achieving, heavily Hispanic high school like Garfield from 29% all the way up to 65% for UC San Diego.
They're engineering ideological success metrics, not academic ones.
That's exactly right. And this whole movement just gained incredible traction during the COVID-19 pandemic. They used the disruption as an excuse to systematically eliminate standardized tests across the entire professional landscape.
The stated goal was explicit, wasn't it?
It was. Across multiple bodies, medical, legal, you name it, the stated goal was to, and I quote, eliminate any aspects of our exams that could contribute to performance disparities.
You really have to pause on that statement.
You do. If an exam is effective at measuring competency, and competency is not perfectly distributed across all groups, then eliminating performance disparities is, by definition, reducing the degree to which the exam tests for actual competency.
That's why the U.S. medical licensing exam, Step 1, was made pass-fail. It was the single most critical filter for residency placement.
It's why law schools are dropping the LSAT. It's why the National Conference of Bar Examiners is diluting the bar exam under their next-gen plan. The entire pipeline for high-stakes professions is being structurally weakened under this banner of ideological equity.
On the corporate side, the make tactics just become quotas.
Outright quotas. Wells Fargo reserving 12% of leadership positions for Black candidates. Goldman Sachs refusing to underwrite IPOs for firms that don't have the required board diversity.
And then there's what the research calls the subtle end game. The practice managers know is illegal, but it happens anyway.
That's the direct exclusion of candidates. Managers are sometimes subtly told to sequester and discard resumes from non-diverse candidates, which primarily means white males, before the formal screening process even begins.
And because it's not just you're illegal.
It happens entirely off the books, through verbal instruction, through insinuation, and the professional managerial class who witnesses it, they stay silent out of sheer terror that reporting it will be the end of their own career. The entire system is maintained by the fear of challenging it.
That fear factor is just. It's corrosive. Okay, so let's look at what happens when these tactics are applied to safety-critical national infrastructure. The FAA seems like the first place to look.
The air traffic control system is a perfect example. It's a system that requires exceptional, measurable cognitive ability. We're talking memory, attention span, visuospatial awareness.
And the old tests, the AT-SAT, filtered for those abilities very effectively.
So effectively that the workforce in 2014 was 83% white men. When that outcome was deemed unacceptable, the FAA started experimenting. They introduced the biographical questionnaire, the BQ, in 2014 to try and tilt the applicant pool. That led to massive legal challenges. Then they adopted the Air Traffic Skills Assessment, or ATSA.
So they changed the filtering mechanism, away from objective cognitive testing.
And towards behavioral and biographical metrics that were designed to produce a proportional outcome. And now we're starting to tally the consequences.
The phenomenal U.S. air safety record since the 1970s is starting to fray.
It really is. In just the first 3 months of 2023, there were 9 high-profile near-miss incidents at U.S. airports. Several where planes came within a hair's breadth of a catastrophic collision. The air safety net is wearing thin, and one has to ask if it's because the people maintaining it may no longer be the most capable.
This erosion of competence extends directly into military readiness, doesn't it? Specifically the U.S. Navy.
It does. In 2017, the Navy had 3 completely avoidable ship collisions. Then in 2020, the USS Bonhomme Richard, a $750 million ship, sunk in port after a fire that should have been contained.
And the debriefs from those incidents were revealing.
Subsequent interviews with officers revealed this recurring, devastating theme. The prioritization of diversity training, social awareness courses, administrative duties, all over fundamental, hands-on ship handling and warfighting preparedness.
And the institutional response to this crisis of competence was what?
To double down on the ideological path, a group called Task Force 1 Navy recommended eliminating or de-emphasizing meritocratic tests like the officer aptitude rating, specifically to boost diversity metrics.
So the feedback from officers on the ground is alarming.
It is. The candid assessment from many officers cited in the research is that they believe the U.S. would likely suffer significant losses in an open naval engagement with a technologically sophisticated peer like China, given the current state of operational focus and the talent pool.
And finally, this decline is visible even in the corporate defense ecosystem. I mean, look at Boeing, one of only 2 major producers of large airliners in the entire world.
Boeing is a staggering institutional crisis. We all know about the 737 MAX crashes, which were linked to cost-cutting, flawed design choices, the MCS system. But the problems go so much deeper into the corporate culture itself.
The KC-46A Pegasus tanker.
That's the one. Their new defense fuel tanker has been plagued by serious technical flaws. But even more concerning is the persistent issue of foreign object debris.
Tools, trash, left inside the planes.
Exactly. Tools, trash, red plastic caps found inside the planes during construction. That's not a design error. That is a fundamental failure of culture and basic quality control on the shop floor. It suggests a deep degradation of the institutional commitment to technical excellence and rigor. The crisis is moving from the core government agencies into the major contractors. The rot is infecting the very pillars of U.S. industrial and military capacity.
That's just a staggering indictment of a company like Boeing, and by extension, the whole ecosystem. But what we're seeing, as unsettling as it is, it's not random, is it? It's the consequence of a deeper structural fault running beneath society.
That's right. And that brings us to the second part of this. Understanding the underlying pressures that are actually driving this collapse.
We have to realize that modern society isn't just a collection of independent things. It's an intricate system of interwoven systems.
That's the crucial insight. Our power grid relies on the communication network, which relies on the banking system, which relies on infrastructure like roads and bridges. When one of those systems fails, the dependency of the others creates a terrifying cascade effect.
Like the 2021 Texas power plant shutdowns. That killed 246 people. It's a powerful example of how a localized failure can turn into a mass disaster because of these interdependencies. We need a way to conceptualize this.
We do. And for that, we can turn to Charles Perrow's theory of normal accidents from back in 1984. Perrow argued that catastrophic failures are, in a sense, inevitable or normal in systems that have two specific structural characteristics.
They have to be both complex and tightly coupled.
Correct. Let's make that real. A system is complex when it has many interacting components with nonlinear relationships and feedback loops. You can't easily predict the effect of one small change. Think of the global financial market or the software stack for a modern airliner.
And tightly coupled.
Tightly coupled means the components need a very precise sequence and timing. There's little to no slack time between processes. If one step is delayed or missed, the whole sequence rapidly fails. The 3 Mile Island nuclear accident was a classic example. A minor blockage cascaded into a near meltdown because the system was too tightly coupled for human managers to react in time.
But the sources we're looking at identify a critical oversight in Perrow's original theory.
Yeah.
Especially when we apply it to the world today.
A huge one. Perrow basically assumed that the people managing these complex systems were highly capable. He took competency as a given constant. He argued that even highly capable people couldn't prevent normal accidents in these kinds of systems.
But the new question is, what happens when the competent managers and technicians are systematically pushed aside for non-technical reasons like we just discussed?
That's the danger. The systems haven't become any less complex or any less tightly coupled, but the capability of the people managing them has been actively, intentionally decreased.
So the threshold for catastrophic failure is just lower.
It's effectively lowered. Accidents that were once very rare and required multiple, highly improbable human errors to occur, well, now they're going to happen with increasing regularity. Catastrophic normal accidents will accelerate system failure, leading to a visible, undeniable devolution in the quality of our infrastructure and services.
Okay, so to quantify and forecast this structural pressure, we turn to a really rigorous framework, structural demographic theory, or SDT.
SDT is incredibly valuable because it separates the slow-building, predictable pressures, the deep structural conditions, from the sudden, unpredictable triggers, like a pandemic or a war, that release that pressure.
And it analyzes societies through 3 compartments: the general population, the elites, and the state.
Right. And from that, it calculates the political stress indicator, or PSI, which forecasts the potential for instability. And the PSI is a function of 3 quantifiable forces:
mass mobilization potential, elite mobilization potential, and state fiscal distress. Let's break this down.
Let's start with mass mobilization potential, or MMP. This basically captures the growing popular immiseration, the dissatisfaction of the general population. It's driven by 3 main factors. The most critical one is the inverse relative wage,
which is the average worker's wage scaled against GDP per capita. So if the economy is growing but your income isn't keeping up, you become relatively poorer.
And more stressed. And the research highlights a really brutal trend here. Between the 1970s and the 2020s, the overall U.S. economy surged, but real wages for low-skilled workers just stagnated or even declined. At the same time, the essential costs of life, housing, healthcare, higher education climbed relentlessly.
That gap creates immense socio-political stress.
Huge stress. The other drivers for MMP are the urbanization rate. Large cities intensify stress and communication, and the youth bulge, which is the proportion of the population aged 20 to 29. A high concentration of young adults facing limited opportunities is like a powder keg.
Which brings us to the second component, elite mobilization potential, or EMP. This quantifies the conflict among the educated high-status class, and this is driven by elite overproduction.
Elite overproduction is the engine of resentment among the educated class. Over the past few decades, the higher education system has expanded at a rate far exceeding inflation. It's just pumping out more well-educated, credentialed people than there are high-status jobs available for them to fill. It's a glut of diplomas.
So we have a whole generation, millennials and younger, who were promised high status if they got a certain degree. They borrowed heavily to get it, and now they're unemployed, or underemployed, or in jobs that are far beneath the status they were told to expect.
They experience what's called relative deprivation. Their absolute income might be decent, but their status and their job security just don't match their educational investment. And this fierce competition among the elites, which is often compounded by obvious corruption, like the college admissions scandals, it leads to movements rooted in resentment.
Like Occupy Wall Street.
Occupy Wall Street in 2011 was a perfect example. It was driven overwhelmingly by college-educated people who were angry at the system that promised them a future it failed to deliver. And this overproduction isn't just in the humanities either. Even STEM fields are seeing this saturation.
And the final component is state weakness, or state fiscal distress, SFD.
This measures the system's ability to maintain order. It's a function of the national debt scaled by GDP, the state's sheer fiscal fragility, combined with a really telling metric: the proportion of the population that expresses deep distrust in government institutions.
That distrust factor is crucial, and we have data on that going back to 1958.
We do. It's a direct proxy for the state's legitimacy in the eyes of the people. Now, the real power of SDT is its predictive capability. Based on these pressures alone, the 2010 SDT forecast was a chilling warning.
What did it predict?
It predicted that the decade from 2010 to 2020 would be a period of sharply growing socio-political instability across the US and Western Europe, and that this would reverse a decades-long trend of declining instability.
And the empirical results absolutely confirm that prediction.
Completely. The data shows a sudden, sharp spike in instability right after 2010 across all the major Western nations. In the U.S., the incidence of both nonviolent events like anti-government demonstrations and violent events like riots increased by an order of magnitude after 2010.
And there was a difference from the last peak of instability in the 60s and 70s.
There was. That peak was dominated by destructive riots. The post-2010 spike includes a massive increase in nonviolent demonstrations. But the common thread is the profound structural inability of the system to manage its pressures. The polity was already fragile.
And if that system needed a stress test to confirm its fragility, the COVID-19 pandemic certainly provided it.
It was the perfect external shock. It drove all the structural components upward. It worsened popular well-being and economic immiseration, which raised the MMP. It increased government dysfunction and partisan infighting, driving down trust, which raised the SFD. The shock just confirmed that the system was already dangerously brittle, and it pushed the U.S. further down that path toward instability.
So we've laid out the erosion of competence in our institutions and the structural pressures, the demographic and economic realities that are causing this system instability. Now we have to look at the cultural context. What kind of people are inhabiting this brittle, failing society?
Right, we're moving from the machine itself to the quality of the social glue holding it together. And the quantitative signs of systemic failure in what you could call civilizational reproduction are stark.
The family unit.
The core family unit. Over 40 years, the disintegration rate divorce, lack of formation, climbed from about 11% to 34%. And critically, fertility rates have dropped well below the replacement rate. We're talking below 1.6.
When a culture loses the confidence and stability it needs to reproduce itself, that vacuum must fundamentally change the personality type that succeeds in that environment.
It does. The security that used to come from family, from community, it now has to be found somewhere else. And this brings us to Christopher Lasch's seminal work from 1979, The Culture of Narcissism.
He wasn't just talking about vanity.
No, not at all. He observed America producing a personality consistent with what psychologists call pathological narcissism. It's a deep cultural phenomenon characterized by a defensive retreat into the self. It's a survival mechanism against a world where security has vanished.
We have a perfect modern example of this personality in the sources. The story of Elena, the Berlin consultant of 2025.
Elena's story just paints 1,000 words. She's 34, successful in a digital job, no children, no partner, lives in a high-rent, minimalist studio. She really represents the ideal of modern self-sufficiency.
But there's a catch.
A big one. The source notes her reliance on a state-sponsored AI wellness companion that her health insurance provides to combat severe urban isolation. And she spends hours meticulously curating her social media performance.
She is empowered, educated, and free, yet she suffers from this constant, low-grade, crushing anxiety.
Right. The resilience that used to be organic, the kind you'd find in neighbors or siblings or parents, has been replaced by professionalized technological care. This is what we mean by defensive narcissism. She's using self-focus and social media performance as a shield against a lonely world where true, deep human bonds have evaporated.
And this cultural collapse is what's driving the rise of hyper-individualism.
We often celebrate individualism as a cornerstone of Western society, but this concept of hyper-individualism is something darker. It's the emphasis on personal success and satisfaction at the expense of social connection and collective responsibility.
Life is framed as a solitary journey.
A solitary journey toward individual happiness and self-actualization. The philosophical stance is basically, I belong only to myself and no one else.
Which leads directly to that mantra you hear everywhere today, I don't owe anyone anything.
And while that may have started as a healthy boundary-setting mechanism against toxic dynamics, it has metastasized. It's become an active justification for profound apathy. It rationalizes ignoring basic kindness, neighborly duties, shared community maintenance. I mean, right down to debating whether you should pick a friend up from the airport.
The flaw of hyper-individualism is that it actually degrades the person. By focusing solely on these external egoistic drives, status, wealth, winning it, actively numbs the deeper human longings.
The longing for service, for connection, for mutual commitment, for surrendering to a greater good. The human being becomes atomized, perpetually sensing this profound void that they can't fill with consumerism or status.
And the consequence of this ego-focused life is a lack of any real security. The sources call it conditional security.
In a world of hyper-individualism, love and acceptance are purely conditional. I am worthy only if I achieve status, or if I perform correctly on social media, or if I adhere to the latest ideological demand.
That network of conditional love is spiritually and emotionally debilitating.
It just obliterates true security. It makes people hypersensitive to judgment, extremely quick to take offense, and unwilling to take real risks like true commitment, because the potential cost of failure is the loss of all of their conditional worth.
And this trend was just dramatically accelerated by social media and the isolation of the pandemic. It amplified the feeling of anomie.
Right, Emile Durkheim's concept. Anomie as a state of normlessness during rapid societal change. The norms that hold society together are unclear, which leads to breakdown. But the modern phenomenon is something like liberated anomie. Disconnection from society, but a hyperconnection to the self. People feel free to act purely in their own self-interest, liberated from any sense of consequence on the collective.
But the human need for connection is primal, so the rebellion against the isolation of hyper-individualism often leads to its dark twin.
Its dark twin, tribalism. Since deep, healthy community is seen as too difficult or requires too much commitment, people seek connection in partisan tribes. It's a false sense of belonging.
It's not rooted in mutual affection.
Not at all. It's rooted in shared resentment and animosity toward an external enemy. Healthy community sustains, tribalism devours. It operates on a scarcity mindset, us versus them, and it demands the explicit destruction of all other loyalties. Your identity is defined by what you mutually hate. It's connection born of animosity, and it just serves to deepen the structural instability we talked about earlier.
So if that's the disease, the sources propose a potential counter-ethos, a different way to structure a life entirely. Relationalism.
Relationalism rejects the premise that life is a solitary journey towards self-actualization. It puts relation at the very center. It argues that the community and our fundamental bonds actually precede the individual.
The core tenet being, we precedes me.
Exactly. You're a node in a network formed and nourished by relationships, family, vocation, geography that often precede your individual choice. The ultimate goal, then, isn't self-sufficiency, it's the deepest possible commitment.
A life lived through maximal commitments.
To a vocation, to a covenantal marriage, to a creed, to a specific community. Commitments made out of sacrificial love without demanding a return or guaranteed security. This relationalist ethos completely reverses the logic of the narcissist.
The inverse logic being,
I possess only when I give. I lose myself to find myself. When I surrender the demands of my ego to something truly greater, that's when I achieve my greatest strength and security. That's the moral ecology that could potentially heal this cultural fracture.
So we've seen the institutional failure, the structural pressure, and the cultural rot. Now we have to look at the strategic element. How are these forces being organized? And that brings us to institutional capture and the resulting displacement of what the sources call the rationalist middle class.
Right. Ideological capture is what gives an organizational principle to the disorder that's caused by all these demographic and cultural pressures.
Yeah.
And this entire movement, it really traces its philosophical roots back to the strategy of the long march through the institutions.
This was a strategy from the 1960s, popularized by people like Rudi Dutschke and Herbert Marcuse. The idea was to change society, not through a frontal assault, but by working within the established pillars of power.
Within academia, media, government, the goal was one of insinuation and infiltration, teaching adherents to acquire the necessary technical skills, how to program and read computers, how to teach, how to use mass media, all while preserving their own countercultural consciousness.
They sought to discredit the values and processes of constitutional democracy from the inside out.
Exactly, allowing these radical ideals to slowly gain control of the levers of power. And today, we're seeing the consequences of that long march everywhere, but especially in academia, where raw objective truth is now often secondary to social impact or ideological compliance.
Ideological fitness has replaced competence as the real metric for success.
Whether you're trying to secure a research grant or just get a good grade. And this has profound consequences for the kind of people who can succeed in that system. The sources detail the tragic story of Julian, the working-class rationalist scientist.
Julian was brilliant, a results-oriented scientist at a legacy university. But he found that to succeed, to get funding, to publish his research, had to be framed within these specific radical ideologies.
The political outcomes had to be prioritized over the objective, raw truth of the data. He was essentially being pressured to commit what he saw as intellectual dishonesty.
So he dropped out.
He dropped out. He was unable to lie or conform. And his self-eviction represents the structural displacement of the rationalist middle class. If the brightest minds who insist on objective truth must either compromise their integrity or leave, then the institutions are left ideologically pure, but functionally hollow.
And innovation and governance will inevitably crater.
This hollowing out extends to high-stakes, life-and-death professions like medicine.
We've already touched on the weakening of the selection standards, the MCAT being eliminated, step 1 becoming pass-fail. This is a direct danger to the public.
It is. And while most doctors remain silent because they fear for their careers, a small number are speaking out about the immediate danger of selecting physicians based on diversity metrics over demonstrable competency in anatomy, pathology, and clinical reasoning.
And we see the same thing in the legal field with the planned dilution of the bar exam under the Next Gen plan.
Again, aimed at reducing performance disparities. It's a direct attack on competency filtering, and it could potentially send thousands of students who are simply not qualified toward legal practice.
And if we look at the broader healthcare system, the consequences are already stark.
The medical misdiagnosis rate has reportedly risen 42% over the last decade. And this coincides with a 300% growth in administrative posts within healthcare organizations.
It paints a picture where life becomes a sacrifice on the altar of administrative complexity, where administrators are prioritizing the correct use of inclusive language over pathology and patient care.
The sheer, overwhelming administrative focus acts as a drag on clinical efficacy. And this brings us to this profound, painful realization for the engaged citizen, the betrayal of the citizen by our legacy institutions.
And these institutions, the Harvards, the mainstream media, the judicial systems, they were granted immense authority based on a foundational promise, a contract.
And that contract was simple. We, the people, grant you authority, and in return, you uphold objective standards, competence, and procedural justice.
But the sources argue that these institutions have just broken that contract.
They have. Elite universities redefine fairness as outcome equality, not procedural justice. The media places truth beneath narrative correctness, prioritizing the story that aligns with their ideological goals. The judicial system is increasingly seen as bending justice toward social engineering.
When the system demands that 2 + 2 must equal 5, the person who insists on 4 is no longer seen as correct. They're labeled extreme or a denier.
That is the core institutional illusion. These legacy names, they still carry the prestige of historical competence, but now they require their participants to actively misalign with objective reality in order to succeed. The betrayal lies in pretending to uphold excellence while actively dismantling the standards required to achieve it.
Okay, it's time to synthesize these 4 interconnected forces of decline. We have 1, the systemic erosion of competence in our critical institutions.
2, the structural demographic pressures and elite overproduction driving instability.
And 3, the cultural atomization, the hyper-individualism and narcissism, coupled with the ideological capture that organizes the entire decline.
And these forces are dynamically accelerating each other. The erosion of competence increases the risk of those catastrophic normal accidents, which feeds public distrust and instability, which in turn fuels the need for hyper-individualistic defenses and the destruction of objective systems. It's a vicious cycle.
The path of least resistance for a society experiencing this profound decay. It's not a sudden, dramatic collapse. It's a slow, grinding devolution.
A persistent reduction in the overall quality of life. We are seeing the trajectory toward complex Western systems operating at the level of, say, high-end second-tier global cities. This means increasingly common power outages, unreliable tap water, rising rates of hospital-associated infections, frequent infrastructural delays.
So absent a massive cultural and governance step change, the primary challenge of the coming decades will simply be maintaining the complex systems we inherited, a challenge we are currently failing.
And if the legacy institutions are, as the sources suggest, functionally hollow, then spending energy trying to reform them from the top down is likely futile. The focus has to shift entirely to private, decentralized action.
The sources suggest that navigating this era requires 3 non-negotiable microactions, a kind of private rebuilding of meritocracy and community.
Actions designed to keep individuals grounded in objective reality. First, data armament. You have to use verifiable statistics and long-term quantified trends, like the SDT modeling we discussed, to resist the overwhelming pressure of emotional narratives and instant sentiment. Logic and objective data have to be your shield against a manufactured reality.
Second, competence hoarding, or building a private meritocracy.
Achieve undeniable world-class excellence in your professional domain. Your value must be so high that ideology can't simply erase you. If public institutions fail to train effective engineers or doctors, then private industry or decentralized networks have to step in to build that capacity privately, focus solely on rigor and results.
And finally, micro-community construction. Since distrust and isolation are the engines of collapse, the solution has to be local.
Build small, intentional networks, maybe 10 people, based on mutual trust and a shared commitment to objective reality. Find the other people who still believe that 2 + 2 = 4 and construct your local reality and your support system with them.
So the crisis we're navigating today isn't just an ending.
It's not. It's a profound and inevitable selection process. It is actively filtering out those who adhere to self-absorption, conditional love, and narrative compliance. And it is selecting for those who adhere to objective standards, competence, and foundational community commitments. The external coordinates of our society may be gone, but objective reality, the North Star, remains. And those who anchor themselves to it will be the ones positioned to build whatever comes next.
A compelling and sobering final thought for you to digest as you consider the structural pressures, the cultural breakdown, and the institutional capture defining our current moment. The knowledge gained from this deep dive is meant not just for understanding, but for application. Thank you for joining us.